So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem with IFAS Extension, Alachua County. I'm the Environmental and Community Horticulture Agent, as well as the Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator. So this program today, I typically like doing as a in-person workshop because we get to build and mess and play with irrigation. But currently the Alachua County Extension Office, we're kind of like in an in-between phase. We have a new office that is opening up in Newberry, and it's probably going to be open in August, but we're kind of in a temporary office right now in Jonesville. But I want to thank everybody for joining us, and feel free, before we get going, just so everyone knows that we have the chat box and we have the Q&A, and throughout the program I'll ask different questions. I'd love to get some feedback from you all, learn about what you're doing in your landscapes and your gardens, because our goal is to really learn about what the importance of water is across the state, and how we need to make sure that if we're irrigating responsibly, but always be on the lookout, for all of our extension programs coming up, that we will always be doing this again on a regular basis, this program, especially when we start thinking about trying to get back into action, where we can start doing those hands-on activities, learning how to calibrate irrigation systems, how to mess with the timers, etc. So before we get going, I do want to let everyone know that I'm recording this, and I will send out a copy of the presentation to everybody. And for security purposes, only I am the one that has the ability to share my screen and use my microphone. But you do have the ability to communicate directly through me through that chat box. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And what I want to ask you all, and to go ahead and put this into your into the chat boxes, what's the number one thing, or what's one of the biggest things that concerns you about irrigation, or one of the biggest things that you want to learn during today's program? Go ahead and put that in the chat box. What would you like to learn? Yeah, just watering efficiently. Yeah. How do we use our irrigation systems to as efficient as possible? And what we're going to talk about a lot today is some of those best management practices for irrigation, on just like little behaviors and tricks that you can do with your irrigation system to make sure that you're not overwatering, which is very common, but also to make sure, that we're following our best management practices and your landscapes are being happy and healthy. Ooh, that's a big question. So I won't be talking about pressure, water pressure specifically from a well, and if you get air in your pump line, but reach out to me. That's something that I can talk to you on a one-on-one basis, because that starts to get to very technical information that we're going to kind of try to avoid the too technical information for irrigation today. But yeah, please reach out to me if you have something like that. Keeping my plants alive during the summer month without overwatering. Yes, that's very good point. Very, very good point. Yeah, proper watering of small fruit orchards. Ooh, yeah. So how we're watering our ornamental landscapes and our productive landscapes with regards to like fruit and vegetables is slightly different. So that's a very good question. Shoo-wee. Yeah. Saving water bill. One of the things that we are going to put emphasis on the ornamental landscapes, just because they're typically going to be the ones where in residential areas throughout Alachua County, that's where a lot of our water is being used, is within those landscapes. So we'll put a lot in about that. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about drip irrigation and its use of and its efficiency. And we'll talk a lot about, some of the neat things that we've learned. We know a lot about drip irrigation, but to really show you the benefits and use of drip irrigation. So let's go ahead and get started. But yeah, those are great things. Those are great, wonderful things. And, if there's something I don't cover throughout this presentation, feel free to reach out to our county extension office. I have my contact information at the end of the presentation. And I can help work with you on those very specific issues that you might have with your irrigation, because that's a tricky thing about some of our irrigation systems is the basic components are all the same, but depending on what you're irrigating, how often it's needed, the frequency, the type of irrigation system you have, there's a lot of details that are involved. So giving blanket making sure I give very specific responses isn't always practical in situations like this as a presentation. So always feel free to reach out to us, but we'll learn a lot from today's program. So let's go ahead and get going. So our agenda, I kind of broke it up into three main sections. It's the irrigation in Alachua County, because it's very important that we talk about that. Irrigating landscapes. So this is really talking about, our ornamental beds, what are those best management practices? And then how do we increase the efficiency of our landscapes? So with those three, those three modules or groups of the presentation, I have like three essential questions. So at the end of the program, I hope, or my hope is that you'll be able to confidently answer these three questions. Why is irrigation important? What happens when we irrigate irresponsibly? And how do I increase the efficiency of my irrigation system? So I know that one person put in here that, they're concerned that they've used, it went up 2.5 times this past month, their water use, and they didn't use too many plants in their landscapes, or they didn't have too much that they were irrigating. So that can have a big impact. So what are some of your, with your irrigation systems, is the biggest concern that you have, is it water use, or is it that we're making sure that we are just using the water as efficiently as possible? They sound very similar. How I asked that question, but water use can be like, how am I using that water in the landscapes? What am I watering? And efficiency is really, how am I getting water there? Let me know if there's anything specific in the chat box. But anyways, I want to spend time making sure that we're talking about irrigation in Alachua County, because Alachua County, we have very specific irrigation codes and requirements. Because even some of the best management practices that we can offer through the University of Florida, we can't technically do in Alachua County, but that's okay, because a lot of the new irrigation standards that we have in Alachua County are actually based off of our research, the research that we have at the university, including those new best management practices that we think are more appropriate to use. So we'll talk a little bit about those. That's in this first session. So let's talk about, what is irrigation and why is it needed? So why do we need irrigation? Put that in the chat box. I have two questions about this slide, but what is irrigation? Why is it needed? Put that in the chat box, just your thoughts. Yeah, plants need water. Yeah, plants need water. And that's very true, but do they rely on irrigation for water? That's a big question. So the answer is, no. Plants do not rely on having irrigation in the landscape. If they do rely on irrigation in the landscape, then they're probably not the right plant for the right place. And we'll talk a little bit about the Flora-Friendly Landscaping Program. Yeah, method of providing water to plants. So the best way for us to think about irrigation is a tool to apply water to our landscapes when rainfall is not sufficient. And when we plant landscapes and when we choose landscape plants appropriately, honestly, you probably never really have to irrigate them once they're established, especially now during this time of year. The rainy season, we're getting so much rain, you never have to have your irrigation system on. In fact, I would recommend, if you don't have it already, go ahead and turn off your irrigation system. Your plants will probably appreciate it. but yeah, think of irrigation just as a tool to supply water to plant material when rainfall is not sufficient, especially for our ornamental beds. Because and the reason I like to say that is because there's a lot of times where we have the set it and forget it mentality, where if we just set our irrigation timers, then what's going to happen is we'll just have the irrigation at regular intervals. But that's not always needed, because especially now, this rainy type of year, we're actually getting more than enough rain to make our plant material happy and healthy. So so let's talk about, like, looking at this image. What's wrong with this image? What do you see? I want you to kind of like self critique this image. Put some of the issues you see in the chat box. Yeah, over irrigation. Yeah, if from a design perspective, this is a very poor design. Very poor design. So for a couple reasons. One person put in the chat box, over irrigation. That's 100% right. Yeah, watering the concrete. I always talk about like some of my landscape pet peeves, and one of my landscaping pet peeves is that concrete does not need irrigation to grow. So anything that ends up on the roadways or the sidewalks, etc., is typically an indicator of poor irrigation design. Or it can be just the system needs to be recalibrated to adjust the sprinklers to make sure water is hitting plant material only. So yeah, watering the concrete. What's another issue that's happening in this landscape bed? One issue that I think is, I always think of landscapes and their functionality. What's the purpose of having certain plants in the landscape? And that tiny little strip of turf grass right along the landscape bed and the curb, that seems like a completely unnecessary. Just turn that into the ornamental bed. Um, yes, water spraying up high, and there was excessive evaporation just because of the poor use of irrigation. So, and that comes down to, so yeah, the plant material selection is important. And so that turf grass, it doesn't serve a function or a purpose. So they kind of have those little pop-up sprinklers right along the concrete edge there, just to help irrigate that turf grass. And thusly, because of the spray of those little pop-up rotors, that's irrigating excessively those ornamental beds because of the direction that they're spraying. And then they have the pop-up sprayers within the ornamental beds, which is just not a recommendation at all. That in any ornamental beds, we use micro irrigation or drip irrigation, because it uses the water significantly more efficiently. Because, when we're spraying out water over the landscape, like what we have with rotors, we lose much of that water to evaporation, and very little gets down to the root zone where the water is actually needed. So drip irrigation or micro irrigation helps get that water directly to the root zone more efficiently than a typical pop-up. And we'll talk more about that. So yeah, this image, there's a lot of issues wrong with it. But irrigation, one of the most important things I like to say is it's a tool to get water to plant material when rainfall is not sufficient. Other than that, turn off the entire system. And that's what our recommendation is, just turn off your irrigation system. So, and I like this image because not all irrigation is strictly just turf grass, but it is a major component of why irrigation is used. And some of the major issues that we have with irrigation is significantly related to just overwatering and overuse, and it actually causes a decline in plant material quality. So some of the major issues that come to our office when people have issues with their landscape, especially turf grass this time of year, is purely associated with over irrigation and overwatering. So it's important to talk about water use. So we're using a lot of our water resources. Many of you have seen this map before, but I like to show this because I think it's important. It's an important an easy way to help communicate the need of water use. So this is the state of Florida land use map in 2005. What you see in red is developed areas, kind of like residential, commercial, institution, industrial, etc. And then that green color, that's just our conservation lands that are permanently protected. And the beige color, that's everything else, whether it be pine, agriculture, you name it. So it's developed, conservation, and then something that's just another use that's undesignated. So this is in 2005, and this comes from the Florida 2070 plan, and it really looks at the need of thinking about how Florida is using our resources, especially our water resources, as efficiently as possible, because Florida is growing in urbanization. So if we look at this is from 2005 with their population, and we expect the population to double by 2060 during this plan. And when that population doubles, we have an understanding of what that land use will look like, that developed land use, based off of population that's coming in, as well as how we're already developing our landscapes. And we're developing these urbanized areas. So this is looking in 2005, and then based off of the models that the GEO plan with the University of Florida put together, they have created this. This is what the population and development pattern is expected to look like by 2060, with that expected population doubling. And with the amount of people that we see coming into the state every single day, we're probably going to actually exceed that population growth by 2060 a little bit beforehand. But when we're thinking about how we're using water now, if our population is doubling, we start to think that there's going to be an increased demand for water. So if nothing changes, our demand for water for residential uses is going to double, which we know is going to increase pollution. And a lot of those pollution that comes from residential areas relates to improper fertilizing. It can be any type of pesticides that are within the landscape that run off. And it could be even just like grass clippings that you don't that get in the roadway and you don't sweep up and they end up down the storm drain. So there's multiple sources of pollution that can come from residential areas. And as that population doubles, we expect that pollution source is going to increase as well. And then with that, there's going to be a decreased habitat. So a lot of that natural area that has typically absorbed rainwater, helped recharge our aquifer, that is getting depleted, and we're losing that natural ability to filter runoff before it returns to the aquifer. And that can lead to more water within some of our rivers and streams and creeks compared to what they've developed over time, just because of as water comes out of storm systems into those water bodies, there's just excessive water when there's that loss of natural area and increase of like impervious surfaces like concretes, roadways, etc. And that can lead to habitat degradation. It can lead to water quality decline. So there's a lot of impacts associated with that decrease to habitat. But it's important to know that we know that the environmental conditions that the population is going to double. And there's environmental concerns that are associated with that population doubling. But there's also those economic concerns and social concerns. The economic concerns, Florida is dependent off of freshwater resources. And if we're not using those freshwater resources appropriately, we're going to see huge state economics. So like our fisheries, our springs, our creeks, outdoor recreation is a major component of Florida tourism. And if we lose that, then we lose a huge portion of our state's economic interest and value. So it's not only an environmental concerns, but it's economics, and the social is that social well-being of having those strong habitats and connectedness to nature, which is a whole other discussion. So it's important that we know that, yes, there's a demand growing and water usage is going to go with that demand as our population doubles. But when we look at water use, we know that approximately 60% of homeowner water use in Florida is for lawn and landscape irrigation. That is when we look at homes that have in-ground irrigation, that about 60% of those homes are using their water for landscape irrigation, which shouldn't be the case. Based off of our science and understanding, that's way too much water for the landscape. And a lot of it comes back to just improper irrigation use, and then that leads to all sorts of issues, the continuing use of water resources, but as well, that increased non-point source pollution, which is a contributor to some of the issues that we see, like the algal blooms throughout the state that can lead to fish kills. So these are impacts that are directly related to improper irrigation. And if 60% of our homeowner water use is attributed to lawn and landscape use, that's not a good thing. That's a lot of water, where it shouldn't be, and we know it shouldn't be that way. But there's also other quantity concerns that we have, not just quality. So with the use of it, industrial, commercial, and residential uses, we have different groundwater streams and lakes. They're all sources, but that water is continually, it's a finite resource, and those demands is going to just increase for that aquifer consumption, and as well as that superficial water resources. And some of the things that we're seeing throughout the state, especially along the coastal areas, are things like saltwater intrusion. And a lot of that is related to that freshwater usage along those coastal areas from like wells, municipalities, etc. And there are some wells that have to be closed because the water that they start to pull up used to be fresh, but now it's too high in its salinity that it's causing some decline in plant material, even killing some of the plants because they're not adapted to salt water. So that's a huge issue, and we're seeing that today, and it's expanding throughout the state in those coastal areas, moving a little bit more inland. So there's quantity issues that we concern ourselves with, and then it comes back to how are we using water as efficiently as possible. And going right into that landscaping component, one of the biggest issues, or the biggest issues that we're seeing in our landscapes, is just overwatering. I always like to tell people that they're over loving the landscapes, because over irrigation and overwatering isn't done intentionally. Because if you can save your water and use less water, have a healthier landscape, and to save money, who's going to argue against that? No one wants to irrigate excessively, and nobody wants to spend that money associated with fighting disease and pests or replacing plants because you've overwatered them. So it's usually an overwatering issue. And there's a lot of things that we start to see when we overwater. So, and it's important because usually if you think to yourself, or if you talk to a neighbor and you say, and you put this in a chat box, I mean, why not put it in the chat box? So if you see a plant is sick, or if it's not doing well, what do you do? Or what do you think people do? It's like, my plant looks sick, so I'm going to fill in the blank. Put your answer there. Put that in the chat box. Yeah. Water it. That's it. Yeah. So watering it, it's like, my plant looks sick, so I'm going to water it. It's usually I'm going to water it, or I'm going to feed it, or put fertilize. Yeah, fertilize and water. That's usually just like the gut reaction. My plants look sick, I'm going to water and fertilize. But typically that's actually making the problem worse, because typically, excessive nutrients through fertilizers can cause excessive growth, and that can just bring in pest and disease, attract pest and disease. Or excessive moisture can increase disease issues. Your roots will be just stunted. They won't grow very well. If you have a turf grass stand, it's gonna have a much weaker turf grass stand. So if an insect comes in, like the dreaded chinch bug, your turf grass will not be able to withstand it. It's not going to be resilient. It's just going to succumb to the bug. Whereas if you have a healthy turf grass stand and you're not overwatering, a chinch bug can come in and you would never know. Because when plants are stressed, and increased weeds is another example of something that is a result of overwatering. But what we find is that if you are watering your plants or your landscape appropriately, whether it's just the rainfall or you're using irrigation as that tool, what happens is you want your plants to kind of like ride that edge of drought conditions because that can help encourage a strong root growth. But if you, the minute you start to overwater them, that root growth might be, it's going to start becoming stunted. You're going to have root rot, and all of a sudden that entire plant starts to get weaker. And once that plant starts to get weaker, you're going to notice it, and you're going to water it some more, and you're going to fertilize it. But what's happening as that plant gets weaker, it's going to have like a big sign flashing over it, or to the bugs and disease. It's like all you can eat buffet, because disease and pest are really attracted to stressed plants. And more than likely, it's a cultural issue like overwatering that's causing those diseases or those bugs to come in and create such a big issue. Because if you have like St. Augustine turf grass, it's like, yeah, you're going to have chinch bugs. You'll always have chinch bugs. But if you have a turf grass that you're irrigating correctly, or other plants that you're irrigating and watering correctly, the pests will be there, but they'll never be at a population that's going to create issues in your landscape. So then you don't have to put down insecticides or other pesticides to control them, because you're just managing correctly and they won't want to be there anyways. So overwatering is stems from is like the foundation to many of the landscape issues that we see. So this really jumps us into the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. So, we're talking about why irrigation is important, and some of the issues that we see with overwatering, or like some of those results of overwatering. But I like to always come back to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, because it's the statewide like sustainable landscape initiative, really looking at the basic benchmarks of sustainable landscape management and design or planning. And the first principle is right plant, right place. And that goes back to, if we match plants to the environmental conditions, then they're going to withstand that landscape and that environment and be 100% happy and healthy. And they require very little inputs, if at all. So if we have an irrigation system, talking about it being a tool to supplement water or provide water when rainfall is not enough, if we have plants that are right plant, right place, and they're drought tolerant, they're going to be perfectly happy. You would never really have to run your irrigation system at all, if ever. So that's right plant, right place. The second principle is watering efficiently. So that's really looking at those best management practices and those very specific details on making sure that we're using water as effectively as possible within our landscapes. And that's kind of like where this presentation is stemming from, is that second principle. Other principles are fertilizing appropriately, mulch, attract wildlife, manage yard pests, recycle, reduce stormwater runoff, and protect the waterfront. So when we think about the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program and watering efficiently, that second principle, really, let's actually say that second principle, watering efficiently, as well as that sixth principle, manage yard pests, it starts with right plant, right place. If you have the right plant selected, they are the right plant for the right place, then you're naturally going to irrigate your landscape. It will be much easier to irrigate, and you'll be able to water it as efficiently as possible, because it's easier to just turn that system off and never turn it on unless you need it. And then manage yard pest, because if you follow right plant, right place, and the plants are thriving within the environment that they're growing, then and you're not overwatering, you're not fertilizing unnecessarily, that naturally manages those yard pests. Whenever we talk about yard pest issues and correcting any issues, it always starts with cultural practices. And that's, are you overwatering? Are you underwatering? Are you fertilizing appropriately? So just following that right plant, right place really sets you up for success, especially when we're thinking about water use nonetheless. So I want to talk about, okay, so we have this Florida Friendly landscape, and we want to make sure that we are having a landscape that the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program is really thinking about water quality and water quantity issues and how we're managing those landscapes and gardens. So what we did a couple of years ago, and we just actually published this research. I'll see if I can send a copy out to everybody so you can read it later. But what we did is we compared what we call as a traditional Florida landscape compared to a Florida-friendly landscape. The traditional Florida landscape is like you go into an HOA or planned unit development, or PUD for short, where it's like quarter-acre lots and you have your 2,000 square foot home, pretty typical standard development in Florida right now. And what we did is we said, okay, here's that total developed like green space landscape. And what we did is those traditional Florida landscape plots, we were following IFAS recommendations. So we're still managing it to the best of our ability, but it was actually 25% ornamental beds, and 75% turf grass, which is pretty standard for those traditional Florida plots. And the Florida friendly plots, what we did is we kind of did the inverse. It was 75% ornamental plants, 25% turf grass. And what we did is in the traditional Florida landscapes, everything was irrigated just with typical irrigation pop-up rotors. That's it. And then in the Florida friendly landscapes, we only used like those pop-up rotors specifically, or those turf rotors specifically just in the turf grass. And the ornamental areas, we used micro irrigation. We actually had two different types that we were just testing out, but that's like a drip irrigation. The other one was called shrubblers. So what we did is we tracked these landscapes for a few years, like everything that went into them, the amount of time to maintain them, the type of maintenance, how much water we were using for irrigation. I mean, anything that you would do as a homeowner, we tracked and managed it and really kind of compared. So we could say, oh, a Florida-friendly landscape uses less than a traditional Florida landscape. So we can have a really true comparison of the two in like a research type scenario. And when we looked at all the water over that time period, that traditional Florida landscape used that 172,000 gallons, a little bit over, but that's a lot of water. 172,000 gallons. And what we did with the Florida friendly landscapes is we followed IFAS recommendations, and with regards to the irrigation and the plants were established, we turned off the entire irrigation system except during periods of drought. We may turn them back on here and there, just to make sure they got enough water to them. And we saw no visual decline in those landscapes at all during that period. Actually, there's one minor visual decline that we did see, and that was actually with the traditional Florida landscape because we had a fungal outbreak was related to water. So if in the traditional Florida landscapes, we used 172,000 gallons of water. I know this might be a shot in the dark for some of you, but in that same amount of time, it was about 3 years. What was the total amount, would you think, of water that we used for the Florida friendly landscapes? And that includes the turf areas as well as that micro irrigation. Go ahead and put your best guess in the chat box. So traditional Florida landscape was using 172,000. And you can give me a percentage. Yeah, so like one person just said a third. Used 30,000. 30,000 was a guess. 35 gallons. Man, that would be good. So this includes establishment, that establishment period. So we put a plant in the ground and immediately started tracking irrigation. 35,000. All right, cool. Oh, 35,000. Oh man, okay, yeah. It would be really cool if it was just 35 gallons. So anyways, let me show you here. Let me show you. I'll reveal it. Whoop. So we used 41,000 gallons in that 3-year period. So it comes out to a little less than, a little more, let me do the math. I'll give you a percentage. I can't remember off the top of my head. So it's about a quarter, roughly about a quarter of the water used of the traditional Florida landscapes. But it's important to note, so like when you're looking at the turf rotors, the turf grass still needed about 31,000 gallons of water. It was a less than rate than the traditional Florida landscapes. Um, excuse me, because like the traditional Florida landscapes, it was looking at that average square foot consumption in gallons. Um, in the Florida friendly, it was only about 51 gallons per square foot. Whereas the traditional Florida landscapes is about 70 gallons per square foot. So the traditional Florida landscape for those turf, drip, and the shrubs was still less than. But it's kind of interesting looking at, so the turf grass was obviously receiving the most water in that Florida friendly landscape. But that drip irrigation of shrubs, drip irrigation would only use not even 4,000 gallons of water in that 3-year period. And that includes that establishment period. Same with the shrubs, just about a little shy of 6,000 gallons. And again, that includes the establishment period. That is a very, very low amount of water. Whereas like the that drip irrigation, that came to about a penny per square foot for those 3 years. 1 penny per square foot. Um, that's nice. And it's really neat because when we were looking at that, so that was the establishment period, and we turned off the irrigation unless there's times of drought. And we would just have to turn on the turf grass about every 10 days because there was a big drought that occurred during this time. It was every 7 to 10 days that we had to turn on the turf grass because due to respiration of turf grass, even our drought conditions, turf grass does really good with no rain for about 7 to 10 days in this part of the state. So every 7 to 10 days, we made sure that we kicked it on because we were literally getting no water. But the drip irrigation and shrubs, we kept them off for about a year and a half. We didn't even run them at all. And there was no decline visually in the plant material. And it's just because we're using water only when the plants really needed it. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's a huge economic savings. That's a huge way for us to protect water quality just by seeing that we're following these basic FFL principles and just irrigating using these like drip irrigation and shrubs. And also just that mixture, that ratio of ornamental beds compared to turf grass. So a functional turf grass, so turf grass that you use, not it's just there and exists. So it really helps out with water conservation, disease, and pest management. And most of our issues that we did occur, like we did have some insect issues that occurred on both plots, but most of the issues that we did see typically related with the turf grass in the traditional Florida landscapes. So it had a huge economic savings. And that was the research, and I'll send that information. And one question that came in was, what are shrubs? Shrubs are kind of like little, you've probably seen them before. They're tiny little irrigation things, little spikes that you put down in the ground. They maybe sit this high up out of the mulch, and they just have like a little spritz of water. So not as efficient as that drip irrigation, but they're significantly more efficient than than turf rotors. And one thing I do like about the shrubs is once you put those drip irrigation down, typically underneath the mulch, it's really hard to go in and move that around. Whereas the shrubs, they're easy. It's like, oh, this doesn't need to be here anymore. It does better in this location. You can yoink, pick it up and put it down somewhere else very easily. So that is what a shrubler is. But but drip irrigation is the most common that we see. So let's talk about that irrigating landscape. So we can see why the FFL is important. We talk about the benefits of conserving water, following the Florida-friendly landscaping principles and using water efficiently. So now let's talk about those irrigating landscapes. So, watering, how often? So it's important to know that in Alachua County or anywhere within the St. Johns River Water Management District, you're following these watering restrictions. So if you're not in Alachua County or St. Johns River Water Management District, call your county extension office to make sure that you have the most up-to-date watering restrictions. And these restrictions are just set, this kind of like as general guidelines. So depending on if it's the summer or the winter, so it changes as the time changes. The summertime, you can irrigate up to twice a week, in the winter up to once a week. And your irrigation days are based off of your address. your address, your house number, whether it's an odd or an even. But it's important to note that this is the maximum threshold. A lot of people set their irrigation timers at twice a week. Again, right now, because of the rainy season, there's no need to irrigate at all because we're getting way more than enough water. So IFAS, we recommend turn your irrigation system completely off unless your plants are stressing from drought conditions or need that water to grow. And right now they don't. So look for signs that your landscape or your lawn needs water. That's the best tool, is learn to read your landscape and learn to understand what's happening in your landscape. And you can literally notice it as you're just walking across the yard to go check your mail or anything like that. And like I mentioned briefly earlier, landscapes prefer to be right on the edge of drought conditions. They like to have water, but they don't like to have too much of it. So the best way to check for signs that your landscape needs water is, if you start to notice, at least with your leaf blades, the leaf will actually start to fold up and close itself. And you can see it in the image. That's the leaf blade essentially trying to conserve energy and reduce and keep itself nice and cool to reduce the amount of moisture that is lost from the leaf blades. And they actually change their color. It's like a bluish gray. That's them saying, okay, now might be time to give me a little bit of water. Another good thing is just, you can actually walk through your landscape and you can actually see your footprints, because there's plenty of moisture in the turf grass. You'll see that turf grass just boink. As soon as you step on it, boink, it pops right back up. But if it's starting to get in that drought conditions where it's like, okay, now I need to irrigate it, you'll notice that it won't have that springiness to it anymore. Or you can just poke around, and if you notice that the top like 4 to 6 inches of your soil seems to be really dry, like if you can take a small soil sample, that's a good way that you can test it as well. Because just because the surface might look dry, you can have plenty of water below within the soil where the plants are happy as can be. Right before we got into this rainy season, we were all, because the rainy season showed up a little too late compared to normal. So if you're like me, we're all just like, all right, where's the rain? Because like my front yard, it's just a mixture of different things, but there's a lot of St. Augustine in it. And I can see the St. Augustine, whoop, it had V's, it was bluish gray. I could walk through it and you could see where I walked. It was not happy, but I don't have in-ground irrigation in that part of the yard. So I would just go out and I just spray it with the hose, just give it a little bit of water and give it a little extra spring, and it liked it a lot. But by doing that, my turf grass, my St. Augustine didn't suffer at all, and it made it through that really hot, dry period that we had. That was a little, due our rainy season coming in late, and it's happy and healthy, as good as it was before. So really following the edge of drought conditions will really make your plants happier and healthier, because they want to develop that strong, robust root system. But you can easily water too much. You only really want to water about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, or your turf grass, apply only 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch when turf shows sign of wilt. And that's kind of going back to that previous slide. And the reason we say 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch is because 1 inch of rain fills the top 12 inches of our sandy soils. So again, that's 1 inch of rain fills the top 12 inches of sandy soils. And the root zone of turf grass is typically between 6 to 9 inches depth. That's where you kind of want it to be. So if it goes beyond that, you're losing water because there's no roots there. So apply only 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of water during the irrigation time, because anything beyond that is going to be way too much. So so that's an important thing. And calibrate your irrigation system regularly. What I like to do and what we recommend at the University of Florida is get little catch cans or just like cat food cans, and you put them, or tuna cans, whatever it is, as long as it's flat walled. And you could put that out in your land around your irrigation area, and you turn on the system and just kind of make sure that the water is being sprayed uniformly across the landscape. Because if it's not being sprayed across uniformly across the landscape where the irrigation system is running, then some areas are going to get not enough water, while others might get too much water. And that will lead to drought stress or disease pest issues. So calibrating the irrigation system, and again, going back to the in-person workshop, that would be something that we would always do, is learn how to calibrate a system. So the depth does not, that 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch does not waver. That's the depth that you need to make sure you're irrigating your landscape at. And it does not, that depth does not vary, only the frequency. How often do you have to do it? You know, again, if we're in that rainy season, you shouldn't be irrigating your plants at all right now, because we have more than enough rain that's happening in our landscapes, or more than enough rain and moisture that's providing water for our landscapes. And also make sure that you don't water past point of runoff. And runoff is just where the water can't absorb into the soil anymore, and it's just flowing across the landscape. And that's when it enters like storm drain systems, your gutters, etc. That's bad. So, but you can see like the short frequent irrigations, you're not going to have, this is the visual, you're not going to have, excuse me, you're not going to have, you're going to have short roots, whereas that those longer, that 1/2 inch to 3/4, you're going to have less frequent irrigations. And a question just came in the chat box. I think it's a very good point of clarification. This is this recommendation I just gave you on these couple slides is just turf grass, nothing else. Nothing else, just turf grass. So if you have a lawn made of like jasmine or another ground cover, you only want to irrigate it during times of drought. And you can actually, let me make sure. Okay, yeah. So outside of turf grass, for ornamental plants, same things. You're looking for drought stress, and that's the only time that when you irrigate them is when you notice that they're drought stress. Usually what happens, you start to see the leaves, they start to discolor a little bit, similar to the turf grass. And the leaves actually, they will droop. They start to get a little droopiness to them. And I always notice it with southern magnolias. You know, right before the rainy season comes in, you'll see southern magnolias all over the place. They look sad and droopy because the leaves are just hanging down really, really low. And they start to curl up a little bit too. So those are all indicators that's like, okay, there might be some drought stress that's related to this plant. Maybe I need to get some water on it. Now, southern magnolias, you still don't have to irrigate, but with all of our other landscape plants, look for those droopy leaves. But it's important to note that plants that have too much water, like our ornamental shrubs, if they have too much water, they too will get very droopy leaves because there's just so much moisture. So it's important to think, okay, if I have droopy leaves, have I been irrigating? Has it rained a lot recently? If it hasn't, then it's more than likely going to be drought stress versus just excess of water. You can also take a leaf and you'll know it's a dry leaf because it crumples up very, very easily like a dry leaf does. Where if it's droopy from excess of moisture, it won't have that crumbliness to it. So that's essentially the rule of thumb for all landscape plants, is you're just kind of looking for that droopiness. But majority of our landscape plants can go a much longer time without water than some of our turf grasses do. Not all ornamental plants, but a lot of the common ones that we see in the landscape, they go a much longer period of time. You know, going back to that Florida friendly landscaping comparison that we were talking about earlier, we turned off that irrigation system completely in those ornamental beds and only turned them on when we noticed times of drought conditions and there was no rain coming in the forecast. And luckily now with some of our irrigation controllers, you can easily hit the bypass button on like a smartphone. You don't have to go climbing over boxes in your garage or anything like that to get to your timer to make adjustments. That's a very good question. So when do I irrigate? When do I water? And this is not just turf grass. This is all plant material, all plant material. Whether it's you have your backyard garden and you're using micro irrigation like grow fruits and vegetables, or if you're using irrigation for trees, rotors for turf grass, whatever it is, you know, that when doesn't change. So you don't want to irrigate between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. That goes back to those irrigation requirements that we have if you're in Alachua County or St. Johns River Water Management District. And that's just because it's hot and we lose a lot of water between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. due to evaporation. The water gets out and quickly goes up. And we lose it. So we lose efficiency during those periods. So then you really have just like that evening, night, morning time. And that's because you have less loss to evaporation and it leads to better turf grass health. So I recommend that you irrigate in the mornings because you get that moisture right down to, you can get that moisture down to the soil, you can get it that depth that you need. And then what happens as soon as that sun starts coming up, what happens is that excess of moisture that was applied that might be on the leaves or anything like that, that will evaporate and that'll dry up pretty quickly. If you do it in the evening or at night, that excess moisture will kind of just, if it doesn't make it down to the soil, it's just going to sit on those leaf blades all night. And that cool temperature, that nice temperature, that moisture hanging out, that's going to be a great opportunity for disease to come in. So it can literally just be shifting and adjusting times to irrigating in the morning if you're using your irrigation system, just to make sure you're using that water efficiently as possible. And then you're reducing that that possibility of having like disease come in and causing issues within your garden or in your landscape. So that again goes to turf grass, ornamental plants, all fruits and vegetables that you're growing. Ideally, it's going to be in the morning, but sometimes it's not possible, you know, depending if you're like an HOA and you have a community-wide irrigation system, and you're running off of different wells, there's a lot of nuances that exist in there. But for typical homeowners, just the morning, if you can do just mornings. Sometimes people have no options and they have to do evenings, or some people have special variances that they can irrigate during the day as well. But for a regular homeowner, you will not be able to get that. Anyway, so water in the morning. So let's jump into part 3 because I know we're creeping up on time. And this is really coming thinking about, okay, so we know why irrigation is important and we know that the timing of irrigation is critical. So look for, essentially just wait for those drought periods before you put any water down on your ornamental beds or your turf grass, and make sure like if your turf grass is water, if you're irrigating your turf grass, that you're throwing out about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, no more. And no less, and only irrigate when needed. So turn off your irrigation systems unless you have an irrigation, turn off your irrigation system unless there's a time of drought where you absolutely have to turn it on. So right now, your irrigation system should be completely off because of the amount of water. So I still want to talk to you about like, okay, here are strategies that you can do today. Like you can get off of this meeting or this program today and you can go start making these changes tonight or this weekend. And we know that it will help increase the irrigation efficiency. So let's go ahead and check some of these. Oh, I forgot. So there's a lot of components about irrigation. And I know this diagram might look a little confusing, but the biggest thing is, I'm gonna try my annotate. There's a lot of stuff that you can get in your landscape. Can you see this blue circle? Double check before I get too crazy. Can you put that in the chat box? Do you see that blue circle? Should be a blue circle that you see. Okay, cool. So some of the big things that you can do are related to that, your timer. This guy right here, that is our rain sensor. Many of you probably have rain sensors on your home. Get a new one. We've learned that they don't really work that well. So they do work if they're maintained properly. And And this is an honesty point. This is a rain sensor. And one of the biggest issues that we have with rain sensors is there's a cork inside of a rain sensor, and it expands and contracts based off of moisture. And once it expands a certain amount, that's telling the timer or the controller that you have that there's enough rain and moisture that it can turn off the system. How many of you, if you have one of these systems, say yes or no if you have ever replaced the cork inside of it? Yes if you have replaced the cork, or no if you haven't replaced the cork. And that's totally fine if you say no. That's a good, honest, that's very good. So yeah, one person said no, and another person said, I've always wondered if they actually have any function. I never replaced the cork. So replacing that cork, after 1 year in Florida, that cork just falls apart and crumbles to bits and pieces. And then no longer is it expanding and contracting, because those rain sensors are supposed to say to your controller, there's enough rain, turn off, and it turns off the entire system. But if you don't replace the cork, it doesn't work. If and yeah, if you never replace the cork, it completely loses its function, and therefore it will never turn off your irrigation system. Your irrigation will always run. It'll just never have that rain sensor saying turn on, turn off if there's rain. So other issues I've seen that are way beyond homeowners controls, I've seen where contractors have put them underneath the soffits and eaves of homes where they're never going to be exposed to rain anyways. So it doesn't work in that situation. So replacing that smart controller, those are some of the things that we have a lot of control over. But then it really comes down to the type of irrigation that you have in our landscape. So are you using drip line irrigation in your ornamental beds? And what kind of pop-up rotors could you be using in your turf grass beds? So those are the biggest things that we have the control over. Valves, everything else, you don't really have too much control over. It's really that timer, that rain sensor, but there's other really cool smart devices that we recommend. And then the pop-up rotors, there's more efficient pop-up rotors that we can use. So these are the things that are kind of in our control. One question I had is, should I refrain from watering young fruit trees until I see signs of drought or wilt, as you recommend for ornamental turfs? So yes, it really does depend on the type of that fruit tree, but typically that's going to be fine, especially now with our with our rain. But if they are not established, make sure you get the plants established. So you're gonna have to water every single day for a few weeks, and then you slowly taper it off. That's going to be the important, is that establishment period. So, but really looking at these control methods within our irrigation system, the timer, our smart controller. So a lot of us have rain sensors. My favorite is the soil moisture sensor, which is this little sensor thing that you just bury about 6 inches in the ground, right at that root zone for turf grass, in like the brightest, sunniest spot of your landscape. And it does the same thing as a rain sensor. But what it does is it's constantly taking that soil moisture reading. So it might be dry as a bone up on the surface, but your soil moisture sensor is saying there's plenty of moisture down here, so it's going to turn off your system. And you don't have to replace that cork, so it works a much longer period of time. It's easier to maintain. It's just, the drawback is if you don't know where you put it, you can lose it. In Alachua County, all new systems, you cannot use those rain sensors with the corks. You have to use like a weather-based system that actually takes weather data through the internet, or have like a soil moisture sensor that's just reading the soil moisture. But anyways, so let's talk about those specific actions or things that you can do in your landscape to help conserve and use water more efficiently. So, looking at those controllable factors and those uncontrollable factors, those controllable factors like plant selection, drought tolerant plants, plants that are right plant, right place, really improve the efficiency of water use in your landscape, where you're putting them. Soil structure, sand versus clay. Clay and siltier, or silt in your landscape holds more moisture a little bit longer than our sand. Um, Mulch can help conserve water. Irrigation and maintenance practices, those are all controllable factors, but things that we can't control, um, so things that we cannot control that impact irrigation is temperature, precipitation, sunlight, wind, soil texture, and like local water restrictions. But anyways, so let's talk about what we can do within our control today. And we could talk about roughly, and I can send you a document that shows, based off of the research that we've done, what that savings per 1,000 square feet per year and that approximate savings in numbers would be. So so let's talk about some of these easy ways to save water. The first one is called install an expanding disc to interrupt rain sensor. So expanding disc is a little bit different than the cork. So that expanding disc is looking at moisture availability, and if there's a certain amount of moisture, it'll cut off your irrigation. And it's an easy way to save water, but it does require rewiring something to your timer, which is actually really easy to do, but it might seem intimidating to make sure that you do it properly. Because in your timer, there's literally just one little wire slot that you just put in for your sensor, and then that's it. So other ways that you can save water, again, beyond just that expanding disc, is looking at ways like the soil moisture sensor, or a weather-based system. So there's a bunch of new ways that we can save water through the smart controllers, beyond just the expanding disc and that rain sensor. So say your sprinkler, it's that calibration of irrigation. So a lot of times, since systems have been set to 1 inch, or the amount of time that they irrigate applies 1 inch, but we only need 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. So if you can cut it down to 1/2 inch, you're gonna save significantly on that water per 1,000 square feet per year, and you'll see that in your irrigation and your water bill that you get if you're not on a well. You can schedule your sprinkler system to replace 60% of evapotranspiration instead of 100. That gets a little bit more technical, but I'm not going to jump into too much of that one. So this is that soil moisture sensor, or evapotranspiration controller. You can save a lot of money just by using one of those. And a huge savings is, think about turf grass functionality. How much turf grass do you have? Does it serve a function? So when we talk about right plant, right place, how we're using that landscape is just as important. So if you have an area of turf grass that serves no function, convert it. And it says not Bahia, because Bahia you don't have to do anything with. But convert that turf area that's non-functional, you're not using it, or it's not the right plant in the right place, into landscaped ornamental beds with micro irrigation. That's where you're going to save the most money, and you can put it together in such a way where it provides such a huge aesthetic value. So the seventh one is convert spray heads. So in your typical landscape, there's pop-up rotors. They're the very standard turf grass rotors that we use in irrigation. There are more efficient pop-up rotors now. They're called microstream multi-trajectory nozzles, and you can literally just screw them into the old ones, and you'll start to save yourself some money. It's just a matter of making sure that you adjust them based off of the MSMT that you get. It'll have instructions on how to get the appropriate spray, the angle, and all of that stuff. So make sure that you calibrate your system as well. Another is install pressure compensating heads. So sometimes our water comes in at a certain PSI to our homes. And that PSI is typically too high for our irrigation systems. And what it'll do is it creates misting. So really fine water particle that when the wind comes, it just drifts it away. So what we can do is we can put pressure regulating heads on every single rotor or every single part of our landscape. You can even put it on the valves in your landscape. That reduces, or it does not allow the water to exceed a certain pressure. And if it doesn't exceed that certain pressure, it's going to help save water. And the amount of money that it costs to switch out the heads, you'll save that money and you'll see that economic savings within less than a year. You'll make your money back, which is really nice. And even for like drip irrigation systems, they have to be at a certain pressure, but you can easily make a single adjustment at the valve box with pressure regulators that you just screw into it. Same thing. It can be like a $10 adjustment that you get for your zone, your irrigation valve boxes, whether it be a micro or even if it be a pop-up rotors, that $10 adjustment, you can see savings in a month easily. But some of the easiest, biggest savings that you can do is, reducing irrigation from 3 days a week to 2 days a week, or reducing irrigation, depending on your frequency, is reducing. How do you reduce your irrigation to don't exceed that twice a week based off of irrigation restrictions? Turn off your system. Do what we call as the skip a week. You'll, by skipping a week, if there's sufficient irrigation, if there's sufficient rainfall, and we're not really in drought conditions, you can easily go an entire week to 10 days without any water on your turf grass. And then if you could just reduce your irrigation frequency during the summer, especially during a rainy season, that's going to help save a lot of water. So I know I kind of like crashed through those really quick, but I'll give you a chart that goes into more detail about each one of those. And it'll talk a little bit about more about that cost per 1,000 square feet estimates, as well as that cost savings. Now, it's not compounding, so you can't do one thing and like pick 5 different things and expect that saving is going to be the greatest, or is going to be the sum of all of those. But you can select those knowing that you're going to end up with this one. I can expect this savings. And if you select any others, it's just going to increase your efficiency just a little bit more. So now that we're at the end of the program, you should understand a little bit about that irrigation in Alachua County, how we're irrigating our landscapes appropriately, and how to increase those efficiency. And that really comes back to that, what we were just talking about. So at this point in the presentation, as we wrap up, you should be able to answer these 3 questions. Why is irrigation important? So irrigation is important because it's a tool to supply water to our landscapes when rainfall isn't enough. So turn off your irrigation system and only use it when it's absolutely needed, because having a healthy plant system can have, or a healthy landscape can have, significant environmental quality to it. But if you overmanage it, that becomes an issue. The second question is, what happens when we irrigate irresponsibly? So that's like thinking about water conservation issues, environmental concerns, economic concerns, from the state, as well as the perspective of our backyard, disease management, our costs for maintaining our landscapes go up. And then the third one is, how do I increase the efficiency of my irrigation system? So that really talks into adjusting your timers, making sure you're maintaining, calibrating the irrigation system. So these are all a lot of things that we really covered this evening in the short time together. So here's some like my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I do have a follow-up survey that I'm going to send to everybody here momentarily. I'll put it in the chat box, but I will follow up with everybody with a copy of this presentation, a recording of the presentation, so you can go back to it. But I know we glossed over a lot, and there's a lot of little subtle nuances in irrigation. So reach out to me for those specific questions, because I would love to help you make sure you're using your water as effectively or as efficiently as possible in your landscape. Because I don't want you to have disease, pest issues, but I also want to make sure that we're using our water resources as responsibly as possible, because it's important for not only us, but the future of Florida. So feel free to put any of your questions in the chat box or the Q&A. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll go fishing to see if I can find that link. So I'll stop share real quick so I can send this to you all, because I did get one question that came in. I want to make sure I address that. Well, so I'll come back and I'm going to address that question that came in the chat box, but I want you all to tell me um, in the chat box is, after today's presentation, what's one thing that you want to go do in your landscape to make sure that you're irrigating responsibly? And I found that follow-up survey. It's going to go in the chat box right now. Okay, so let's see. Go ahead and buy more mulch. Do 3-inch depth mulch, and that's going to save you a lot of water. Yeah. Yes, watering vegetables with non-overhead irrigation. That's really, really good. Check shutoff valves. Yeah, check your rain sensor. The the cork is actually really cheap, and it's really, you just unscrew the top, plop a new cork in, and you're good to go. Absolutely. This is wonderful. This is wonderful. So that's a very good point. I'll read this one out. So it says, my irrigation system is off. Cool. It says, we have had over 10 inches of rain in the last week in Duval. Yes. Yeah, Duval, I mean, this whole area has a significant amount of rain. My neighbors water daily. Whew, and in the evening around 8 p.m. No one polices it, but it is obviously reflected in their utility bill. And really comes down to, how do we put out the information, because the billing does not necessarily reach people, because most people pay online automatic and they have no clue. So yeah, there's a lot of really good things that we do. So we help with GRU. We'll identify our high water users, and we send we send letters to a lot of those high water users, to kind of say, hey, for some reason you're using a lot of water, and um, and hopefully that makes changes. Some people you'll see, like high water users, it's just only momentarily, because they're establishing new plants. Not want to say all. So sometimes we'll send those flyers to people that don't necessarily need it, because they're establishing new plants, so they go beyond their typical usage. Or something like, there's a break in a line and they didn't notice it. But there are some times where it's like, we'll send out letters to high water users, and they don't care, because because of the money, it doesn't bother them. So there's other ways. It's like, you have to think about, how do we incentivize positive use and positive change. So in Alachua County, they do have enforceable policies that the Alachua County's Environmental Protection Department can enforce, and they do enforce them, but it's really tough to do, because staff size that has the ability to do the citations, as well as when most people are irrigating, it's in the middle of the night, or in the morning, so it's hard to really tell the frequency and how often people are doing it. So there is some self-regulating and reporting that happens, but it does make it really hard. And there has been times where I do have the ability to kind of look at what water usage is throughout the GRU service area. And so there's been programs or things that we've done in the extension offices, like, how can we specifically target those high water users for like outreach and education. It works sometimes, not always. The most successes that I'll put the survey back in again. It's just like a Qualtrics link. Some of the most successes that we have had, honestly, haven't been from necessarily the individual homeowners making those decisions. There are a lot of benefits, but if we're thinking about like, how do we make big changes, it really comes down to that code and building development and policy. So like just in Alachua County, with our old county code, you could use rain sensors, and now you can't. You have to use for new systems or systems that are upgraded significantly, you have to use like soil moisture sensors or other advanced weather-based controllers. That making that change in that policy is going to save significant amount of water over time with all those new systems compared to if it maintained its course. So that's where you're gonna make the big changes. But the best thing is like education and really showing that the importance of that water is not an excess. Watering and irrigating your landscape does not mean you're going to have a happy, healthy landscape. Actually, you're having that excess of water and those impacts of excess of water, and really showing that you can have a happier, healthier, better looking landscape that's way cheaper to maintain, because you're following just best management practices. So I got a lot of good things in here that y'all put in. Yeah, so watering vegetables with non-overhead. Yep, check those. Yeah, test the amount of water that you're using in the system. So you can actually get like little flow meters that you can put on your irrigation system to kind of see, just like a general rule of thumb, how much water you are using. And it's a really cool way to test to see if there's actually any leaks. In some advanced systems, it's kind of cool. So say there's a leak in your landscape, you can find that leak because if you're walking around, you'll step in a big puddle of water, because more than likely that means there's a broken pipe under your foot and the water's just all bubbling up. But there's some systems that are really advanced now that are constantly monitoring PSI within the irrigation system. So if it notices that PSI suddenly drop, that's an indicator that there's a break, and it immediately shuts off the system and won't turn it on. And it'll actually send you a notification like on your phone saying there's a PSI drop and it needs to be investigated or troubleshooted. So there's some really, really fancy things. But just not always economical for homeowners, or they're just too complicated, not worth it for homeowners to do in the first place. Yeah, check for signs in water when needed. Yeah, instead of systematically. Yeah, I always call it like I think it was Rompo Peel. I call it the Rompo Peel method, the set it and forget it. Let's not do that with irrigation. Turn your system off unless your plants say, hey, I'm thirsty, and it'll be great. Yeah, always review your drip irrigation, because over time the drip irrigation can easily kind of wear down or clog or break. And so, luckily, micro irrigation is very easy to replace and very economical to replace too. Oh, yeah, I see why you don't get the survey, because I'm only sending it to myself. There it is. there you have it. Sorry. I've done that before. I'm sending stuff and I realize I'm only sending it to the panelists, not the panelists and attendees. So there's multiple panelists. We can send just messages to the panelist, and not everybody. Yeah, rain gauge. Rain gauge is easy, just to see how much it's rained. Yeah. It's like, oh, it rained today. How much did it rain? Oh, we got a ½ inch. Cool. I'm set for like a week. And what I do, when managing irrigation, I typically, I'll calibrate my system once a year. But as the first time you do it, it might be like, oh, this is taking forever. But once you do it one time, the next time there's a lot less work you have to do, because in 1 year's time, you're not going to have your system go off that much. So it's just keeping a good control of it, and just making sure that water is being spread uniformly. So that calibration, it's pretty easy to do. It just takes a little time to do it, but you can easily do it on a weekday morning or weekend morning, or a weekend on a Saturday or a Sunday, whatever you choose. But it's been really fun. If you're looking at ways to upgrade your existing system, if our old controllers, there's some new controllers that you can get that are very economical, that are super fancy, and just upgrading to a newer controller that runs your schedule and all that stuff is really nice. Rainbird, Hunter, they all have really nice things. And the weather-based controllers are really fun because it's literally speaking and reading data from surrounding weather stations, and it'll say, "Oh, it's Sunday. It's supposed to rain on Tuesday, so we won't irrigate today." So it's really neat how it's looking at that weather to determine like what weather have you had. Looking at that historic weather, it's rained like 3 days ago, and you got 1 inch. It's like cool, and also look in the future, and it'll help adjust your timing and irrigation. So those things are really neat. But like the soil moisture sensors, yeah, they cost like $100, which kind of stinks. But if you're irrigating and you want to make sure you have the most up-to-date system, those are easy to install, and you'll offset that cost pretty quickly. Or just go out and get a new cork for your rain sensor, or just replace your rain sensors, because rain sensors are they're not too terribly much. $20, $30 maybe, the whole sensor in itself, and just replace it. And a lot of these things that you can do with your irrigation system are actually pretty easy to do and doesn't require any specialized services. So there are some like major things, like if you need to redo all the PVC lines, or you can do them yourself, but it takes a lot of effort, and making sure that you have the right PSI and flow sometimes might take an irrigation technician to make sure that that's all correct. Otherwise, you're going to have a bunch of irrigation system issues to make sure it's designed correctly. But a lot of like the little things, replacing heads, making sure you're using something more efficient, or just calibrating. You get a little irrigation key and just making sure the rotation is appropriate, the throw is appropriate. It's all really, really nice and easy to do. Oh yeah, it is today's, yes. So in the survey, I accidentally have last year's date. I meant to use today's date. So it says April 2020, but it's supposed to say June 2021. I apologize. Good catch. It's today's webinar. So I do this program every single year, and I use the same evaluation every single year to see how it's changed each year. So I'll make sure I adjust that before I send it out to everybody. I'm updating it right now. Okay, good. All right. Well, are there any other questions? I know we're right out of time. I had us going right to 5:30, but usually we take between 60 and 90 minutes. But if there's any other questions, I can help answer those. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. I will follow up with the resources. And again, reach out to me if you have any specific questions, if it's well related, if it has to do with understanding policy, how do you have some issues calibrating, or there's some other troubleshooting issues that you do have, reach out to us. And I'll also send you some information. In Alachua County, we do have the turf swap program, which is a rebate program that if you're making changes in your landscape to reduce irrigation use, and like say reduce turf grass to non-functional turf grass areas to create more ornamental beds, the county has a rebate program. Also, Alachua County, we do have a resource that is like a troubleshooting type of resource, where some of the staff from Alachua County's Environmental Protection Department will actually come out, and they can help do like a systems check of your irrigation, which is a really nice service that they can offer. Again, they're limited in staff, but it's also worth calling to see if you can get on their schedule. And I'll send out those resources, of course, with a follow-up email by the end of the week. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and I appreciate you all taking the time to hang out with me this evening and talk a little bit about irrigation. But thank you, and reach out to me or IFAS Extension Office here in Alachua County. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, we love looking forward to it. And I love seeing you all at our next upcoming programs. All right, y'all take care and have a good Tuesday evening. Bye-bye.